This is the case of child killer Keith Nelson. On September 29, 1999, Keith Nelson approached James Robinson in the parking lot of A1 Staffing. A1 Staffing was a temporary work service in Kansas City, Kansas. He asked James if he wanted a job hauling cement out of a basement. He had never met James before. James agreed because he needed to earn some side money. And they left the A1 parking lot in Keith's white Ford F-150 pickup truck. After arriving at the job site, Keith began saying some very bizarre things to James. He told James that he would like to kidnap a woman and take her away from the city so he could torture, rape, electrocute, kill, and bury her. Keith Nelson revealed to James that he wanted to do this because he knew he was going back to prison for burglary and other petty crimes. He said if he was going back to jail, he wanted to go back for something big. James acted cool about it, but this really tripped James out. He was going to report Keith to the police but changed his mind, deciding that Keith had to be messing with him. On October 2nd, 1999, Myshan Matson, a young medical student, was assaulted outside her apartment building. During the late hours of the night, Keith Nelson attacked her, brandishing a knife and threatening her life. Despite her struggles, he tried to forcibly move her from the apartment parking lot to his pickup truck. Throughout the ordeal, Keith continuously verbally abused Myshan, using derogatory language. Despite being handcuffed and threatened, Myshan summoned her courage and managed to shout for assistance, although Keith covered her mouth with gloved hands. In a desperate move, Myshan went limp and collapsed to the ground, allowing her to escape momentarily. As Keith fled the scene with Myshan's purse, he issued menacing threats, warning her not to look at him or else face dire consequences. Despite her cries for help, Keith evaded capture, leaving Myshan shaken but alive. Pamela Butler, a bright and intelligent fifth-grade student at the age of 10, cherished attending school, adored her teacher, and cherished her friendships. Approximately 1 week following Myshan's attempted abduction, Pamela returned home from school as usual. Later in the day, she went rollerblading to a nearby gas station to purchase some cookies and soda. Her sister Penny observed her departure. A short while later, Penny witnessed Pamela skating back home. As Pamela passed by a parked white Ford pickup truck with its door slightly open, a man emerged from the truck and forcefully seized Pamela, throwing her into the vehicle before speeding away, leaving Penny in a state of panic. Hearing Penny's screams, her older sister Casey rushed outside and witnessed the pickup truck driving off, with the man, later identified as Keith Nelson, making an obscene gesture towards them. The commotion caught the attention of Paul Wilt, who attempted to pursue Nelson's truck but ultimately lost sight of it. Nevertheless, Wilt managed to note down the truck's license plate number, 177CE2, and promptly contacted the authorities. Between 6:30 and 7:30 p.m. on that same evening, Carl and Shirley Condra traveled to their church in Grain Valley, Missouri. Apart from attending services, the Condras also undertook custodial duties, cleaning the church during off hours. While at the church, they noticed a white Ford pickup truck parked behind the building, which struck them as unusual since there shouldn't have been anyone present at that time. Unfamiliar with the truck and finding it unlocked with no one nearby or inside, they grew suspicious. Eventually, they resumed cleaning the church before returning home. Later that night, while watching the evening news, they heard about Pamela Butler's abduction and learned from the news report that the description matched the truck they had seen at the church. Realizing the significance, they promptly contacted the police, who investigated but found the truck had vanished. Meanwhile, after Pamela's abduction, Keith Nelson visited his mother Nancy's residence in Kansas City, Missouri. Together, they went to the Oasis Bar, located just a block and a half away from Pamela's home. Nancy patronized the bar while Keith engaged in playing video games. Following their time at the bar, they made a stop at the same gas station where Pamela had purchased her snacks, as Keith needed to buy cigarettes. Subsequently, Keith and his mother drove to Keith's girlfriend Kelly's residence, where the three of them watched news coverage regarding Pamela's kidnapping. According to Kelly, Keith displayed no signs of anxiety, remorse, grief, or any notable reaction to the news story. He appeared entirely composed. Later on, Keith and his mother returned home. At around 11 p.m., Patty Griffith, Nancy's neighbor, spotted Keith Nelson on the passenger side of the truck, wiping the dashboard. Periodically, Keith glanced up and down the street, checking for observers. By approximately 2 a.m., Keith drove off in his truck. Shortly afterward, he called for a cab to pick him up, being approximately 10 blocks away from his house. The dispatcher who handled the call recalled Keith's demeanor as very calm and even shared a joke, appearing to be in a good mood. Later that night, Patty was awoken by a noise and noticed Keith's truck was missing, and he was pacing in the yard. The following day, the police discovered his abandoned truck, completely cleaned out and left unlocked with the keys on the floorboard. Meanwhile, a massive manhunt had been initiated by the police to locate Keith Nelson and Pamela Butler. 2 days after the abduction, on Thursday, Lori Torres, a civilian employee of the Kansas City Police Department, went to the Santa Fe rail yards to deliver lunch to her husband. During her journey, she took a detour and spotted Keith under the 18th Street Bridge, recognizing him from police photos. Apparently, Keith had attempted to lower himself from the bridge, but fell and became immobile. Lori promptly alerted the police, who concluded that the only way to extract Keith was via helicopter. While awaiting the helicopter team, a crowd gathered, and someone from the crowd questioned Keith about the girl's whereabouts. Keith responded, stating he knew but refused to disclose at that moment. Later that day, Keith was formally charged with the kidnapping of Pamela Butler and refused to cooperate with authorities in locating her. The subsequent day, law enforcement officials searched the woods and fields east of the church in which the Condras pronounced seeing Keith Nelson's truck. There, they made a demanding finding. They determined Pamela Butler's white sports activities bra and her underclothes. Not lengthy after, they discovered the 10-year-old's nude, dead frame buried below a pile of brush, a twine become wrapped tightly around her throat, and post-mortem become conducted. The effects found out several scrapes, abrasions, and blunt pressure trauma to Pamela's mouth and head. She have been beaten. Her hymen have been torn close to the time of loss of life. Redness and infection have been found in her genital location, indicating she have been raped. Pamela's respectable reason of loss of life becomes strangulation. Her underclothes become dispatched to the FBI for evaluation, with semen inside the crotch area. This matched with Keith Nelson's DNA. While awaiting trial, Keith Nelson remained incarcerated without bail. His unfortunate cellmate, Edward Frazier, recounted disturbing conversations he had with Keith. Keith would openly discuss his dark fantasies of kidnapping and inflicting torment upon women. He expressed his desire to construct a cell specifically designed to imprison women, detailing his twisted plan to stalk a potential victim for a week, meticulously monitoring her every movement before eventually abducting her. Once captured, he intended to confine his victims to a cell furnished solely with cotton for them to lie on, denying them a bed and forbidding them from showering or even having access to toilet paper, leaving only a toilet as their sanitation option. Keith elaborated on his disturbing fantasies, expressing his intent to keep his victims restrained so he could subject them to his every whim. He callously described various positions and methods of sexual assault, emphasizing his desire to exert complete control over his victims. Ultimately, Keith callously revealed his intention to kill his victims once he had exhausted his sadistic desires. While he did not divulge the specifics of how he would carry out these murders to Edward, he did mention his plan to dispose of the bodies the old-fashioned way, hinting at dumping them in a river. Another unfortunate prisoner named Stephen, who had the cell was next door to Keith's cell, reported hearing disturbing sounds coming from Keith Nelson's cell. In March of 2000, at about 3 a.m., Stephen heard a voice coming from Keith's cell. He recognized the voice as Keith's. Stephen heard high-pitched, low-volume type screams that sounded like a little girl crying for mommy. These sounds were repeated multiple times during a 5 to 10 minute period. A few days later, while Stephen was awake reading in the middle of the night, he heard similar sounds coming from Keith's cell again. The sounds were a series of short, high-pitched screams. Stephen heard Keith talking in a little girl's voice, crying for her mommy and asking for help, begging to not be hurt or killed. The next day, Keith did it again. It was Keith reenacting the murder of Pamela to himself. The last time Keith did this, Stephen confronted him saying, "How could you do that to that little girl?" Keith replied, "You wouldn't believe it." On October 25, 2001, a trial was convened, resulting in Keith Nelson being convicted of the murder of Pamela Butler and subsequently receiving a death sentence. In August of 2020, he was executed via lethal injection. Throughout the proceedings, and even until his execution, Keith Nelson exhibited no signs of remorse for his heinous crime.